This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 792 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I've been doing this bold predictions episode for years now, and it's always an episode that people ask me about because they look forward to it more than other episodes. I think it has to do with my general approach to fantasy football. On this show, on the Late Round Podcast, I'm usually giving you analysis that focuses on a player's range of outcomes. I want to give you the tools to make your own decisions, all while injecting some of my own takes. But my takes are generally, I could see this happening, but I also recognize that this could happen too. It doesn't mean that I don't have strong takes. I do. It just means that I look at this game through the lens of probability. With this bold predictions episode, I sort of take that away. I'm only looking at one side of a player's range of outcomes to come up with these predictions. It's a little different than my typical take, which is probably why people want this episode. I also try my best to frame my bold predictions in a realistic way. What good is it if I sat here and said Chris Olave is going to finish as the wide receiver 75 this year? That's just stupid. It's a silly prediction. I still want this to be actionable in some way. So with that in mind, I'll be talking through 10 bold predictions for the fantasy football season. There were 5 more that were emailed out with the Late Round newsletter. And if you're not subscribed to that newsletter, you can do so for free at lateround.com. You won't get the other bold predictions if you did that after the bold predictions newsletter went out, but you can read those predictions in the newsletter archive on the site. Just make sure that you're signed up for the newsletter because number 1, it's totally free. Number 2, you get additional content from me. I'd assume that if you're listening to this show, you'd be open to the idea of more content from my brain. So sign up now for free at lateround.com. All right, let's get to these predictions. Tony Pollard will finish as this year's top fantasy football running back. This prediction's bold because yes, Pollard does get drafted high, but not as the RB1. He's usually a second-round pick in a lot of drafts. Now, Tony Pollard's a good running back. He's seen runs of 10-plus yards in at least 13% of his rushes in 3 of 4 seasons in the league. He's one of just 15 qualified running backs since 2011 with 3 or more of those seasons. But he's only played 4 years in the league. That's how efficient he's been per rush. As we know, Ezekiel Elliott is no longer on the Cowboys. Zeke has missed 3 games over the last 3 seasons. In those games, Pollard's running back rush share per game, 73.4%. That's a very strong number. He had an average of about 16 carries per game. His PPR output was 31.2 points, 33.7 points, and 21.8 points. The ceiling is insane for Tony Pollard in this offense. It's evident. Maybe he doesn't get there. Maybe they use other backs more than we think in this offense. But clearly the RB1 overall is in his range of outcomes. Rachaad White will outscore Travis Etienne. This prediction's bold because Rachaad White goes well after Travis Etienne in drafts. There was one game last year where White played without Leonard Fournette. In that game, he had a 21.4% target share. He scored 19.9 PPR points. Now, I'm not expecting that kind of production from him week in and week out. It's not a great Buccaneers offense. We don't even know if Rachaad White's good or not. What I do feel confident in, though, is that he's a good pass catcher. In my prospect model, he comped very favorably to David Johnson, and he had one of the best pass catching profiles that you could find. And that goes a very long way in a running back scoring a lot of fantasy points. Now, on the flip side, Travis Etienne, what if he ends up being a between-the-20s runner? Tank Bigsby's in town. What if they want to use Tank Bigsby more at the goal line? After all, Travis Etienne converted just 3 of 13 goal line rushes last year. What if they want to use Tank Bigsby more as a receiver? Etienne didn't even hit an 8% target share per game rate last year. So there is a chance, I'm not saying this will happen, but there's a chance that Bigsby digs in to Travis Etienne's workload and he takes away the touches that are most valuable. So even if that happens to some degree, that means Etienne is not going to live up to his ADP expectation. And then if Rachaad White does see a 12-13% target share in his offense, he can exceed his. And that's how Rachaad White would outscore Travis Etienne. Both Deontay Johnson and George Pickens will finish as top 24 wide receivers. This one's bold because according to Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings, Johnson's wide receiver 28, Pickens is wide receiver 36. But this can happen. On average since 2011, we've basically seen 4 or 5 wide receiver teammates finish in the top 24 per season. Now there's some obvious candidates this year, the Bengals, the Eagles, the Dolphins. But what about the Steelers? Historically, middle round wide receivers who have middle round wide receiver teammates without a pass catcher being drafted early from that team, they end up exceeding average draft position expectation at a really strong rate. Johnson and Pickens play 2 distinct roles in this offense. Johnson's probably going to have the higher target share, Pickens the higher down the field ADOT. If this Pittsburgh Steelers offense takes a step forward, both of them could benefit greatly. Jayden Reed will lead the Packers in receptions during the second half of the season. This one's bold because Reed's a late round option who gets drafted after teammates Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs. But this could happen. Would it shock anyone if Jayden Reed's just the best wide receiver on this team? If he ends up being better than Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs? Now don't take that the wrong way. Christian Watson's one of my highest rostered players this year. I talked about that on last week's mailbag episode. He's the right risk-reward type of pick. But we don't know for sure that Watson's going to be a stud. We don't know for sure that he's going to command a super high target share. Christian Watson's score in my prospect model looked almost identical to Jayden Reed's. The expectation is that Reed's going to be their main slot guy to start the season. He's going to be on the field in 3 wide receiver sets. If he shows out, and if the other 2 wideouts don't live up to the hype, then he could have a big second half like we see with a lot of rookie wide receivers. Ty Chandler will outscore Damian Harris. This one's bold because at the moment, Chandler's RB67 according to Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings, Harris is RB41. As I wrote in the newsletter, this might be the most random bold prediction that you've ever heard in your life. Damian Harris is just not the type of running back that I go after. James Cook is slated to see the most touches in that Bills backfield this year. And we know that Damian Harris is not that much of a pass catcher. And then all the while, Latavius Murray has had a good summer. What if Murray ends up being the RB2 in this offense? What if Murray's the guy who's seeing goal line work? I'm not saying that that's what I'm projecting, but it's at least possible right now. Damian Harris absolutely needs that goal line work in order to be usable in fantasy football. All the while, Ty Chandler is looking like the second best running back in that Minnesota offense, behind Alexander Mattison. And as we know, Madison doesn't have a ton of experience being a lead back in the NFL. And Chandler was an interesting prospect who entered the league with a comp of Elijah Mitchell in my prospect model. He's a really good complement to Alexander Mattison, but I think that he could steal some receiving work too out of that backfield. So for this bold prediction to come true, we basically need 2 things to happen. Number 1, Damian Harris doesn't score nearly as many touchdowns as a lot of us are projecting. Maybe Latavius Murray has something to do with that. And then number 2, Chandler's going to have to dig into the receiving role in that Minnesota backfield. I think both of those things are possible. Austin Ekeler will fail to finish as a top 5 running back in points per game. This one's bold because a lot of people have Ekeler as the RB2 in fantasy football. Now, it's fine if you want to draft Austin Ekeler this year. I obviously have no problem in drafting him. I did over the weekend. He's in a great offense, they should score a lot of points, and he's probably going to be the goal line guy. And he's going to get his fair share in the passing game too. But speaking of that passing game, there are some concerns. The Chargers added Quentin Johnston to the mix, and right now, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams are both healthy. That actually might matter, because in 2022, Ekeler saw a pretty decent drop in target share when both of those guys were active. Without Keenan Allen and Mike Williams in the lineup, Ekeler's target share per game rate, 27.6%. Absolutely crazy. When Keenan Allen played but Mike Williams didn't, that fell to 22.6%. When Mike Williams played but Keenan Allen didn't, it was 20.3%. When both of those wide receivers were active last year, Ekeler's target share per game rate, 12.9%. There's a new coordinator in town in Kellen Moore too. What if he deploys these running backs differently than we expect? What if targets aren't funneled as heavily to Austin Ekeler? Again, I'm not saying that that's the probable outcome. I'm just saying that it is an outcome. Like any other running back in fantasy, there are some red flags with Austin Ekeler. Kenny Pickett will outscore Aaron Rodgers. This one's bold because Pickett always gets drafted after Aaron Rodgers in drafts. I think this can happen, though, given the rushing component. Last season, Kenny Pickett was 11th in the league in fantasy points per game earned via rushing. He had 3.2 points per game. Aaron Rodgers ranked behind Matt Ryan within that statistic. He averaged 0.91 points per game with his legs. And yeah, Aaron Rodgers is a better passer. That's why he's getting drafted way ahead of Kenny Pickett. But Pickett is entering year 2. He's got better weapons than what Aaron Rodgers has. I'm not saying that Deontay Johnson and George Pickens are better than Garrett Wilson. I'm just saying as a whole. So don't underestimate the potential sophomore year jump. And what if Aaron Rodgers, again, thinking in terms of range of outcomes, what if Aaron Rodgers just extends his poor 2022 season? What if he's not the MVP caliber player that we saw a couple years ago? Then all of a sudden, this prediction is not that crazy. At least one rookie tight end will finish as a top 8 option in points per game. This one's bold because there have only been 2 rookie tight ends to finish as top 8 options in points per game since 2011. That's PPR points per game. But I think that this could happen this year. For those of you who have not been around this offseason, I have a tight end prospect model that's sort of in beta mode. That model dates back to 2015. And in that model, there are 14 tight ends with a 90th percentile score or better. 3 of those 14 are from this year's class. Dalton Kincaid, Sam Laporta, and actually Luke Musgrave. All 3 of those tight ends happen to have immediate opportunity in their offenses. That does not always happen. Rookie tight ends aren't always running a high number of routes because they're learning to both pass catch and block. There's a lot to learn at tight end when you enter the NFL. But 2 tight ends, Kyle Pitts and Evan Ingram, they ran a full number of routes as rookies while sitting in this 90th percentile bucket. And it just so happens that Evan Ingram was a top 5 tight end in PPR points per game as a rookie. Kyle Pitts was tight end 11, but he only scored 1 touchdown. Yes, rookie tight ends have historically been very, very bad in fantasy football. But I would argue that not all of these rookie tight ends have walked into the opportunity that Kincaid, Laporta, and Musgrave are walking into this season. And not all rookie tight ends are as talented as these guys are. Anthony Richardson will finish as a top 7 quarterback. This one's bold because Richardson goes well after QB7 in a lot of drafts, especially more casual, maybe home league drafts. Fantasy managers are very hesitant to invest in rookie quarterbacks. And I get it. Since 2011, among all rookie signal callers who played at least 8 games, only 6 were able to finish as top 12 players in fantasy points per game. But all 6 of those players had something in common. They generated points with their legs. Shocking. Each of them scored at least 3.5 points per game on the ground, and all 6 of them were able to hit 50-plus rush attempts. During that same time frame, so since 2011, we've had 5 top 10 NFL draft pick quarterbacks who averaged 5-plus rush attempts per contest as a rookie. Those 5 were Deshaun Watson, Cam Newton, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, and RG3. 3 of those players scored at least 21 fantasy points per game. The other 2 were both over 17. And I'm saying all of this because Anthony Richardson, he is a freak athlete. He's going to run the ball a lot. He's arguably probably the most athletic quarterback that we've ever seen enter the NFL. So the rushing numbers should be there. If the passing numbers are basically average, he can easily get to this mark. The last bold prediction today is that Zach Charbonnet will outscore teammate Kenneth Walker. This one's bold because Walker was a monster last year, and obviously he gets drafted well above rookie Zach Charbonnet. But this could happen. I'm not taking Charbonnet straight up over Kenneth Walker. Now, I do have more Charbonnet this year than Walker, just given cost. I also don't think that this has that high of a chance of hitting without an injury. But I've said this all offseason. The Seahawks drafted Zach Charbonnet because he does things that Kenneth Walker does not. As a rookie last year, Walker finished last in success rate among 100-plus attempt backs. He was worst at gaining positive yards per rush. His pass catching wasn't totally there either. He had a 7.5% target share per game rate when he took over that backfield. What are the things that we look for in a fantasy football running back? We want goal line work and we want pass catching work. Charbonnet is a do-it-all grinder who can catch passes out of the backfield. Walker wasn't very efficient at the goal line last season. So what if they see Walker as this home run hitting threat, which is exactly what he is? He has that upside per rush, but they see Charbonnet as more of the grinder, as more of the pick up the tough yards kind of running back. In turn, that could mean that Charbonnet sees more goal line work than we're projecting. And then all the while, Kenneth Walker's receiving profile has not really been there dating back basically throughout college. So what if Charbonnet steals receiving work from him too? Again, I'm not projecting this to happen. I'm just saying that in their range of outcomes, Charbonnet is seeing the higher valued touches from a fantasy perspective. And if that happens, then he could outscore Kenneth Walker. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on X, on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out the Late Round Draft Guide. If your draft is coming up over the next week and a half, you can do that on lateround.com. And also remember to follow the Late Round Fantasy Football account on Instagram. It can be found on there @LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.